So welcome everyone. I'm Karen Kukil, the interim curator of Rare Books, and I'm honored to welcome you to the 7th McGrath Lecture in the Book Arts. These lectures are sponsored by the Mortimer Rare Book Room in honor of Harold P. McGrath, who was a beloved letterpress printer in the Pioneer Valley for over 50 years. As many of you know, Harold worked for Leonard Baskin at the Gehenna Press, Barry Moser at the Pennyroyal Press, and Alan Robinson at the Cheloniidae Press, among other presses. The purpose of these lectures is to showcase the extraordinary book arts talent in the area. I know there are many students and faculty in our book studies concentration in the audience who really appreciate these lectures. It is my profound honor to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Robin Price, who has been creating artist books for over 30 years. Robin's books are collected by nearly 70 international and national institutions, including the Harry Ransom Center and other universities near Denton, Texas, where she was born and raised. She has also exhibited her work in over 70 venues across the United States, including Yale and most recently the University of Washington in Seattle. The printing studio of Robin Price, printer and publisher, is currently located in the Star Mill in Middletown, Connecticut. But Robin has been collaborating with poets, illustrators, bookbinders, and even rare book librarians on the West Coast and East Coast since 1984, when she graduated from Pomona College in Claremont, California. She learned letterpress printing from Christy Bertelson at Scripps College, Susan King at Paradise Press, and most especially from Gerald Lang at the USC Fine Arts Press for 4.5 years before she moved east in 1995. Somehow she has managed to support herself one project at a time ever since, with a little bit of lecturing and also teaching occasionally at Trinity College and Wesleyan University. Each artist book in her oeuvre is unique, layered, and full of surprises. I'm constantly impressed by the symbolism of the smallest detail in her work, from a V-shaped indentation in a cherry wood case to a hologram of an 18th century surgical knife in the cover of the anatomy lesson. She combines science and art, but is also interested in the intersection of the creative and the spiritual. Music, such as Gorecki's symphonies or the guitar playing of Pepe Romero, is often the engine of her creative process. The slow pace of typesetting allows her to drink in many of the poems at the center of her work by William Everson, Yusef Komunyakaa, and others. She embraces Japanese patterns and fairy tales, Polish lyrics, and even printer's errors, which is very risky. But it is perhaps her propensity to collaborate with other artists to make something together that would not be possible individually that is the crowning glory of her press. Please join me in welcoming Robin Price to discuss some of these chance encounters, synergistic partnerships, and elastic possibilities in her lecture, lusciously entitled Surrendering to the Book.
Having an out-of-body experience, it's weird that I'm the one that's getting up in the lectern instead of staying in the audience of this room like I've been so many times. Thank you so much for inviting me up here to participate in this esteemed lecture series, of which I have attended many, including the two most recent ones, Michael Kutch and Daniel Kelm. How's the volume? Okay? All right. Thank you to Karen Kukil and Barbara Blumenthal for their support toward this day and time and for presenting the exhibition. The poster Barbara made for this event is so cool, I saw no need to use something different for my title slide here. Most especially, I'd like to thank Martin Antonetti, who originally invited me while he was still here at Smith. Here's the disclaimer. Before I begin, a quick note about what may happen during the lecture or the Q&A following or afterwards at the reception. More than usual, I may forget what I was saying or be slow in getting my words out or not remember your name. I'm still recovering from an early July concussion, which was the 5th in less than 5 years. People ask, gosh, how did it happen? And I can see them imagining all kinds of trauma. But this latest one was a seemingly mild impact incurred while giving water to my cat. I had to cancel teaching at Trinity College this fall semester and other work commitments. But I am so pleased to be with you here today, among many dear friends, some who've driven quite a distance. I have a deep fascination with language and a desire to animate it. I enjoy many different kinds of collaborations and creating a diverse body of work with a variety of subjects. There are recurring inclinations, working in limited editions, researching broadly, the purposeful use of chance in both concept and execution of work, and using letterpress printing in combination with other media, such as drawing, painting, and collage. One of the books I've been reading during this concussion recovery is Rebecca Solnit's A Field Guide to Getting Lost. As we as readers sometimes experience, the simple word reading, let's get you going, there. The simple word reading doesn't seem to encompass all that we can feel while living in the world of the book, that gravity of falling into, being surrounded by, enmeshed in, where the world of the book and our body no longer feel like separate entities. The greatest potential for experiencing this immersion in the most multi-sensory way, of course, happens when we are with an artist book that speaks deeply to us. Repeated communication over the years, a third entity emerges, made of the book and the reader, viewer, handler. I'll read the first entry in Danielle Vogel's Between Grammars. This is a small book, it's about this big. She's a young writer who just began teaching at Wesleyan. This is her first book. I attended her transformative reading there a few years ago. Volume, body. The book rearranges itself in your life to have it, a dwelling, that one is at once within and without. Language tides the skin line, soon a rib cage, a spinal column, a skull, an open mouth, a full set of teeth, fusible suddenly to a word. Pass through it so that you might put it. Of cell and sound, a slit causeway, the page, a wet field, a place to pass our mouths, irregular as the course. In the Field Guide to Getting Lost, Rebecca Solnit addresses many different kinds of getting lost. The state of being lost geographically, experienced by early explorers from colonizing countries or scientists entering uncharted territory, the loss of memory, the loss of species at such an alarming rate in our present, the loss of body parts as caterpillars and snakes transform themselves, loss due to abandonment, and most importantly for my talk, the purposeful placing of oneself in what feels like an unexplored realm. Solnit's book has been an excellent companion while I've been distraught about losing my cognitive abilities once again. While in the process of moving toward acceptance, of course, in all our lives, we're often in that process of acceptance, I witnessed the phrase voluptuous surrender that came dancing out of the page into the air and brightly lit. Quoting from that book, to lose yourself, a voluptuous surrender, lost in your arms, lost to the world, utterly immersed in what is present so that its surroundings fade away. To be lost is to be fully present, and to be fully present is to be capable of being in uncertainty and mystery. She's talking about losing oneself as a conscious choice, placing oneself in the unknown, a chosen surrender. An early working title for my talk was How to Be a Follower in the Book Arts. But Solnit's phrase kept having a field day in my head. I want to explore how important it has been and is to me to feel like I surrender to the content and I listen to the book as it is in the process of taking shape. In last year's McGrath Lecture, Daniel Kem spoke about his joy in making things due in part to the engagement with materials, listening to them, being informed by them, understanding their properties and what they want to do. Active listening is a phrase Greta Sibley used in some lovely correspondence we had in August when I was trying to finalize the title and description of this talk. Active listening acknowledges not only the state of being receptive, but also nods toward our participation in being with the creative process in this way. In Centering, in Pottery, Poetry, and the Person, the potter and writer M.C. Richards describes watching another potter at Black Mountain College give a demonstration. Quote, "He was centering the clay on a potter's wheel, but not looking at the clay. He had his ear to it. He was listening. 'It is breathing,' he said, and then he filled it with air." 2 pages later, she writes, "It is in our bodies that redemption takes place. It is the physicality of the crafts that pleases me. I learn through my hands and my eyes and my skin what I could never learn through my brain." This is still M.C. Richards. "I must maintain a kind of dialogue with the clay, listening, serving, interpreting, as well as mastering. The union of our wills, like a marriage, it is a beautiful act. The union of natural intelligences, the intelligence of the clay, my intelligence, the intelligence of the tools, the intelligence of the fire." That's the end of the quote by M.C. Richards. For me, surrendering to the content begins with getting inside the world of the text, going as deep as I can, then rediscovering myself within that world and figuring out what I can bring to the realization of these words in the form of an artist book. The word voluptuous might connote luxurious pleasure, red velvet drapes and caviar, but this state of receptivity and listening I'm talking about is not that. Neither is it just about listening to materials and techniques. Our great ideas crumple in the face of an unforgiving paper or an intriguing technique that refuses to cooperate with our plan. We stayed in our heads too long, ego enlarged, ears closed. Within that template of questions we generally have in the attempt to coax form out of text is, what kind of paper should I use? We experiment with answers to this question, alongside other variables, to tease out what direction the book wants to go. But it is possible to step away from that question, which paper? One time I almost missed my cue to step away, but thanks to the persistence of my apprentice, Brittany DeNigris, at the time, I surrendered to what was finally obvious. I had to print Love in the Time of War onto silk, not paper. But for a long time beforehand, I was determined to use paper because I had worked out in my head an entirely different approach. Before I get to the content of this 2013 press book of poems by Yusef Komunyakaa, I'll show you some slides of the process of staining the silk, which came in a natural off-white color in 40-yard rolls imported from Shanghai. Here I'm grabbing a piece of silk and wringing out the excess stain, which was a base of walnut ink crystals, that's derived from peat, watercolor, and a small percentage of acrylic medium. so to help bind the stain into the fabric and give it a tiny bit of body. And here we are wrestling with this dripping, wet, sticky piece of silk, spreading it out onto its drying shelf, the grid pattern of which provides a subtle element to the surface. Then with the sheet still wet, onto the background base color, slightly different for each of the folio stacks. I either added color or took some away by painting with hot water. Here is a spread of sonnets 2 and 3. The content of this book is a collection of 25 sonnets Yusef Komunyakaa began writing in 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq. These poems address the convergence of being in war and experiencing love, a variety of kinds of love. My own merging with this content, these wrenching poems, was a struggle for many years. At one point, I had decided I couldn't pursue it because I felt the project needed me to agree with what I felt was a truism of the book, that war is inevitable. I conceived of a book with a dos-a-do binding. On one side, Komunyaka's very masculine sonnets, and on the other, selected poems from Jude Nutter's I Wish I Had a Heart Like Yours, Walt Whitman. A devastating look at the horrors of war. After weeks of working up the nerve to approach Yusef about this idea, I did so, and he provided a simple, gentle no, and sent a delightful manuscript about animals for my perusal. At that point, I'd been wrestling with his love in the time of war poems off and on for years, and I suddenly realized I desperately wanted to make that book. I'll read from the second to last poem. I am Abir Ozen Hamzen Janabi. I am 1,000 years old. Once, a long time ago, the Tigris flowed through me as I gazed up at the sky. The eyes of the soldiers made me look at the ground. They followed me in sleep, hungry dust birds calling. Now I am ash, a bundle of the night's jasmine blossoms and beliefs. The soft, supple silk pages are encased in an armor of an aluminum cover. Daniel Kelm co-designed the binding with me, and it was produced at his studio in East Hampton, Mass. Photochemically etched onto the covers is a pattern derived from camouflage fabric. Here we are, meeting at his studio in September 2012. I have been so fortunate to work with Daniel on a number of different projects. By the way, next week, he trots off to Los Angeles, where he'll present talks at the Getty Center in conjunction with 2 exhibitions about the art of alchemy. A final note about the craft of this book. The soft shapes that show through the text pages are made this way, with colored paper inserts sewn in. Here, Yusef signing the silk pages, that was tricky, with me preparing each colophon folio beforehand, slipping in a sheet of paper to absorb the fabric marker ink that bled through. Back to Rebecca Solnit. Back to Rebecca Solnit and her exploration of Lost. She quotes Virginia Woolf from her street haunting essay, describing the pleasure of setting out across London in the late afternoon with the excuse of buying a pencil. She becomes, quote, part of that vast Republican army of anonymous trampers whose society is so agreeable after the solitude of one's room. Into each of these lives, one could penetrate a little way, far enough to give one the illusion that one is not tethered to a single mind, but can put on briefly for a few minutes the bodies and minds of others. When I read that, I think, dissolving of identity. Particularly when I was coming of age in the world of the book arts, beginning in the mid-1980s in the Los Angeles area, I was surrounded by an emphasis on press style. And not just the fine press or private press side of things. Even one of my strongest heroes, Susan King, had something of a recognizable style with her groundbreaking Paradise Press artist books. Consider Gabrielle Rummans, or Leonard Baskin, or Walter Hamady, for example, men whose work defined much of the pillars of, say, the last 2 to 3 decades of 20th century fine printing. Here we might think about these artist printers selecting content that fit their predefined style, or more accurately, a previously chosen realm of expression to work within. Of course, those realms can, and did, encompass areas of risk and experimentation. But looking at the work of the grandmother of contemporary letterpress artist books, Claire Van Vliet of Gehenna Press, yes, you see some bits of recognizable style within any given decade, but over the years there is a staggering degree of variety. It was Claire's work that particularly leapt out at me in the spring of 1984 when I was first seeing work of this kind in my last semester at Pomona College, taking the letterpress class taught by Christine Bertelsen at the Scripps College Press. Claire, not only was she a woman who had been running her own press for decades, and last year there was an exhibit of 60 years of Gehenna Press. My slide here is 10 years out of date. But there is such stretching and risk-taking. After being well established in the fine press world, she used low-tech rubber stamp illustrations for a housewife's diary. There were bold woodcuts by Peter Schumann of Bread and Puppet Theater. For many publications, her delicate paper pulp painting, as in Lilac Wind, her quilt books such as Aunt Sally's Lament, and so on. In 1984 and beyond, not only did I not have a clue what my style was, I felt plagued by that issue as well. I felt plagued by that issue as well in my studio art major, concentrating in photography. But eventually I gave up trying to find that style, that strong identity, and slowly began embracing what I now see as a defining approach in my work. In a 2004 review, Connell Gallagher described me as a, quote, chameleon among book artists. And that remark remains one of my favorite compliments. More than 10 years ago or so, I finally made the connection between my childhood self, so very talented at mimicry, which continued in various ways into my 20s and 30s, and the ease with which I can slip into another person's creative output. Written or spoken language, imagery, music, and slowly merge with it. Sometimes it seems to the cellular level. I spent much of my first decades in this world thinking it was absolutely possible to slip into another's mind or body, wondering why we don't do that since the potential for it is so available. That somehow this fluidity and dissolving of boundaries should be in the natural order of things. One further investigation into this attempted merge with content by careful listening. What happens when you generate the content yourself? Of course, content can be defined as something other than text, but I am usually working from that core. The listening gets trickier when you are the author or compiler, as I was in a kind of backhand way with 43, according to Robin Price, with annotated bibliography. So many syllables. I mixed chance and choice there. Initially, I strictly followed the results of chance parameters I had set in a kind of John Cage calculated chance operations way. By using the number 43, my age at the genesis of the project, as something like a viewfinder, to extract texts from books significant to me during my years as a book artist. I counted to the 43rd sentence, or 43rd line or paragraph, looked at page 43, counted 43 something or other from the back of the book if I didn't hit on something interesting while counting from the front. I also used multiples of 43, 86, 129, lots of counting. Here are just a few of the original documents for ease organized by the collections I consulted, starting with my own. And yes, I came to Smith too. Once all excerpts were literally sliced individually and out on the table, then I had to figure out what to do with them. After starting to put like things together, whatever that meant, on the work tables, of course I got very dizzy, confused about direction, etc. I put tentative category or section titles at the top of these tan sheets you see here on the back wall of my studio, and kept moving the text slices around, trying out different configurations, being sure of a certain path, following it for a while, then having to let it go. At back here, you see a photocopy of one of those sections, Fauna, which follows the Flora section of the book. Each new double-page spread in the book represents a different category. Handwritten notes here are between me and my studio assistant at that time, Ann Thompson. This is the books section. You can see that type very faintly at far left, running vertically in widely spaced caps that are actually printed on the back side of the grid paper. There has to be a shift when trying to listen to your own, quote, content, a stepping back and seeing what it does and how it wants to arrange itself in its new physical home, no longer pixelated. To be coddled by one reader, given confused looks by another, you make it for the ones who are going to come back again and again. You want them to continue finding little treasures, different perspectives. The background accordion that structurally supports the main text graph paper is formed of pre-existing maps that depict areas worldwide along the 43 parallels. For the rest of my talk, I'd like to look at not yet touched on categories of collaboration and the use of chance, as these concerns have evolved over the years in my work. 43 Deluxe involved a deep collaboration with Daniel Kelm. Unlike our previous ones, or ones I've had with other bookbinders, where I lightly have my hand on the steering wheel most of the time, but more than happy to give it up for those steep climbs in structure land, for 43 Deluxe, together we devised an elaborate container for these 12 copies, which followed the completion of the standard edition, of which there were 86 copies, 43 times 2. Neither of us knew where we were headed when we began. He designed a structure that, quote, tumbled like the river that runs through the text sheets. The first big book of the press was the 1995 Book of Revelation with artist Barbara Benish. The 12 large images, the page height here is 16 inches, are a combination of our efforts. She carved linoleum found on the streets of Prague, her first time to carve anything. I hired a printmaker to eke out reproduction proofs. 2 zinc plates were made for each illustration. A background solid silhouette, onto which I executed all the color monoprinting. Then the keyline image was overprinted in black, i.e. the images that Barbara carved. Our MO for the color trials was a genuine back and forth, her commenting on the proofs I usually did without her. She moved to Prague from Los Angeles while we were working on the book. My commenting on her written notes or paint color swatches. For the 2001 Slurring at Bottom, A Printer's Book of Errors, I collaborated with the young Emily Larned, recently graduated from Wesleyan, who apprenticed with me for a year, primarily to work on this book together. We invited 10 different artists to work and play on sheets we provided them. They were given free rein with an expressed preference for the sheets to remain neutral pH, but that wasn't mandatory. We accepted all the work, surrendering to the unknown, from the different kinds of artists. Purposely, we'd only supplied a couple of sheets over the edition of 60, so that mistakes were a given. And as best we could, we tried to provide a situation where perfectionism had to be tossed aside. Emily and I collated each copy differently. Of the 6 signatures or sections of folded sheets in the book, only the first and last ones are collated the same in any one copy, so that a title page appears at the beginning and a colophon at the end. This was actually an idea that Emily insisted on. No 2 copies are alike, either in collation or in what each of the 10 artists did with their sheets. We also varied the way sheets were folded in the middle 4 sections of the book. This slide shows what is the same text sheet in both copies. Hard to see, but there's pale type onto dark stained Japanese paper on the right in both instances. But it faces a different page in the 2 different copies. One, an acrylic painting by Mary Allen, the other, another text sheet. This is text. When I say text sheet here, I'm talking about text that we newly printed onto the sheets. And this one provides definitions for proof and run-up sheets, something we were definitely using in the book. All of the sheets used for the book were actually sheets rejected from previous press books I'd printed, transformed by sanding and painting or staining to create palimpsests for new text and new artwork. Errors all around. A healthy way to look at what can be a craft-obsessed line of work. In terms of its category within the world of chance, slurring at bottom is both an additive and combinatory blind collaboration. Additive is like Exquisite Corpse, where you can easily see this person, or anonymous or whatnot, this person did that, this. Combinatory is when it can be hard to suss out who did what, but there is a purposeful not talking about it in that particular collaborative way when it's a blind collaboration. Only recently have I made the connection between what has previously felt like 2 different realms. One, the more inherited from the fine press world, you're the handmaiden to the poet frame of mind, embracing the opportunity to dissolve one's own boundaries and merge into another's content. And number 2, embracing chance as the operative model in concept and or production, a different opportunity to relinquish control. I'm especially interested in combinatory blind collaboration, especially when you cannot identify who did what. I want to do more of that. Lastly, a very quick look at what's to come from the press. Here's an early prototype for the chapter 1 scroll of the Song of Songs, just the beginning of the printing, with not nearly as much layering as planned for the edition. Barbara Benish and I are working together again. Actually, we've been at it for over 10 years, so you can imagine a lot has changed over the years. It will be in Hebrew and English, the scrolls opening out from the right to preference the Hebrew reading. 8 scrolls, one for each chapter of the text, housed in a gorgeous curvy wood container in 2 parts, so you can lift the thing. The English translation is by Hannah and Ariel Bloch, with whom we are closely consulting, actually just Hannah. Israeli type designer Liron Lavi-Turknech provides the brand new Hebrew type, and she is creating 8 custom letterings, one for each of the scrolls, to which I'll be intertwining the English translation. This pair of pictures illustrates one of the many ways in which Barbara and I communicate about the images or design, or the container. I tossed her this photograph that I purchased at a farmer's market. And the next day, by text message, she sent me this charcoal drawing. Now, mind you, she's already done a great number of charcoal drawings that I'm using for the book, and I have already been hanging out in that world. And so when I saw the tomato, and especially against, I was wearing a black skirt, and I just photographed it against the black of my skirt to make it sexier. I knew she'd go for it, but I had no idea it would be so quickly. I close now with the last entry in Danielle Vogel's Between Grammars. And water returns to water, released, reshaped, each letter a dispersing, decanted into another receptacle of noise, the sound re-entered through its dispersal, condensed and evaporated again. That's it.
Does anybody have questions before we go to the reception?
I particularly welcome questions from students. I know it's kind of hard to raise your hand, but surely you might have a question.
Let me just get my watch.
Michael.
I'm curious, maybe speak a little, I don't know if I have an actual question, but speak a little bit towards the inspiration. As this talk was a lot about surrendering to the book, but I'm curious how then you see being inspired to do a project as it relates to
Right.
surrendering.
Yeah, I don't just, do that. Thank you. That's a really good question. You know, like for so many of us, it's often about serendipity. I think it's what you place yourself in the state of being open to at any given time in your life, you know? And the universe tosses you things, and you either notice them or you don't.
It seemed like you were talking a little bit that there were some ideas that you were ruminating over for a long time, and then it was the right moment.
Yeah.
Is that your process, or?
I'm so slow. I'm glacial. I'm usually. It's like I just imagine this room as a huge suitcase as you ask that question, and I stuff it, all these possible things. Let's research that. Let's, investigate those paper properties. Oh, will this adhesive work? Oh, is the text really saying that? And I just like to sort of excrete all these things and have them laying around, and my studio is usually a mess. And so I'll just, I don't think I've ever published a book on the year that I've announced that I would. Because I'll get to a certain point and think I'm done, and then something just holds me back from going on. And then I eventually figure out, oh, it's really not right yet. Is that more kind of answering your question? Okay, I got a thumbs up sign. And Sidney Berger is indeed the rare book librarian. He's going to ask a question, but I'll just say he's the rare book librarian that Karen referred to. And I'm sorry I didn't show a slide of Ravaged with Joy, poems by William Everson, that Sidney was instrumental in pointing me toward. Yes?
When I was working with Kim Berger, who was also a wonderful printer, he took the texts that were given to him, and he surrendered to the texts for a time. Because he said the text is what guides what comes out.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, he had to take control, because he couldn't let the text dictate to him up beyond a certain point, and then he
Uh-huh.
took control.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Surrender is only part of it.
Yes, and it on the spectrum of how much a part of it or not, you know, there might be some gender question there, and you know, what one's own interests are. I'm sorry, but I am going to quote you, Greta. I took it out of the talk proper, but I just can't not credit you with, you know, the really perfect subtitle for the talk. Neither a bully nor an acquiescer be. We had some great back and forth. But to very much address what you're talking about, and not only the maker pushing and pulling, and I just want to stay in that open kind of place for as long as I can. And, you know, my ego's going to hop in and do stuff, uninvited or not, but again, with things that Greta wrote me about, it just reminded me how parallel that situation is with someone who is approaching an artist's book as a receiver, viewer, handler, becomes more and more, you know, the books that I take out from my own collection of other people's work, that I take out again and again and again. I can't wait to show them to somebody who's never been to the studio before. And, you know, your relationship with those books changes, and it's, I just think that give and take of any kind of creative process is what it's all about. And I love that word surrender for how it feels to me, and that's why I hung out with it for this talk. Ruth, yes?
One thing I noticed about your work that I wish I saw more of in artist books is that your work never seems overproduced. I see so many books that just look so self-conscious to me. They are trying too hard, there's too much showing off what can be done. And to me, that's the antithesis of listening to content. That if you really live with the content and you listen to it and it guides you and you respond to it, there's a resonance that goes both ways. And that's the resonance that I see in your work, which is never overproduced because
Thank you.
it's balance. So, touche.
I'm not entirely sure why, but that made me think about how Gerald Lang of the McGrath Press, starting out in the Twin Cities, and then he moved to USC Fine Arts Press to direct it, and I was his assistant for 4.5 years, and that's when I really learned the nuts and bolts of letterpress printing, typography, particularly working with handset metal type and traditional book design. And one of his phrases, sorry, in my brain, it just jumped to a different one, but I'll come back. One of his phrases was, oh, here we go. Oh, anybody can learn how to print, any fool can learn how to print in an hour or so, and then it takes 10 years to get a little bit better. I remember getting to a point where I finally had what I thought was a lot of control at the press, especially, and that if I wanted to move the type form over or the paper feed guide over 1 point to make it oh so perfectly centered, I would do that. And this is when I started exploring the use of chance and relinquishing control, because I realized I was wound up in a tight knot in that perfectionist pursuit of craft, I think, that can get you to that place of overproducing, maybe. you know, like, hey, I can do this now. And, you know, but it's like you gotta ride your own roller coaster.
The flip side of overproducing is restraint. And restraint is evident in your work without being bland. I mean, it's restrained in a way that respects the content and what you're trying to say.
Thank you. Well, I am actually a loudmouth Texan at heart, and so being restrained in my work is the place where it sits.
I see a good thing there.
Yes, Meredith.
I'm not sure I was getting all the info in the
Slides.
the edition sizes.
Uh-huh.
But I think I was seeing a variety of some unique works.
Yes.
And I'm curious about a bit more about your process in how things take shape. When is it clear that something's a unique work, or is that kind of a place to explore possibilities that might lead to additions?
Yeah, I know that certainly there's some people who use it that way, and I think that's a great way of working. I usually know ahead of time that it's just a one-of-a-kind thing, and then there's a lot of variety within that. I want there to be more. But it's also because, you know, I've got this hat of Robin Price publisher, and the press books that I publish and whom I have subscribers for, and then others who buy frequently. There's lots of careful considerations about edition size, about editioning and what makes sense for editioning, and, you know, like hand staining that silk fabric for Love in the Time of War, that took, I think that was a solid 2 months worth of work. And it was this beautiful rhythm that we got into, and toward the end we're like, what are we gonna do when we're not staining silk anymore? I don't remember where I was going. I'm sorry. The brain does this. I had a feeling it would. Yes, you can get me back on track. Here we go.
Part of what I'm curious about is the relationship between the content, the spark of inspiration, and then the process that arises from that. So I'm wondering a little bit more about where that fork happens, where it...
You mean the fork of edition versus one of a kind?
Right,
I don't know, I never, an idea either, so, you know, I'll be reading something, so I am really instigated by language, and I'll be reading something and this fragment will pop out, and, you know, like I mentioned with voluptuous surrender, and I'll want to just work with a tiny bit of content. I'm going to just show you. Yeah, here's here's a series that that you know well, because Mark Tomlinson is doing the binding on this. So this is a series of 5, and each one is different. This is pretty large. Size is close to 20 inches tall. And it's just this little tiny fragment of text that's on the bottom right, over here and over here. And can you read it up at the top? Many years have gone by until this moment. So just that little tiny bit of text, and I just knew that I resurrected sheets that I had going from over 10 years ago. I'm often kind of recycling in different ways. And I had these sheets with the pastel, all this kind of dancing around pastel work that was on Arch's Text Wove. And I had done that by not looking at the sheets and, you know, this kind of thing on full-size, parent-size sheets. And then when I was actually redoing, I thought I was going to redo a one-of-a-kind piece that I showed at Codex 2 years ago. Codex, the big international book fair in Berkeley, biennial. And I thought I was going to redo that. And then that text went away and this came in. It's kind of meandering. Rivers are really prominent. And so I did some underprinting to go with this text, and then I stained it with these colors, and then I printed more on top of that, and then I added painting and collage. So yeah, usually the one-of-a-kinds are often with just like this little bit of text that I just want to have it be kind of like a jewel, you know. And then the edition work has to feel, I don't know, like a substantial thing to do X number of copies of. And that question is usually both, you know, what can I afford up front? How labor intensive, how crazy is it to do? Okay, yeah, it's too crazy to do that many, you know, so those kinds of questions. It's time to, oh, yes, Stefan.
Have there been failures? I know where you've worked on something for a long time and it just never comes together.
Oh, yeah.
And the second part is there something that's been ruminating in your mind for years and years and years that you still want to do? So maybe some specific project that's still there rolling around?
Mm-hmm.
Will you tell us what that is?
Well, actually, what my mind leaps toward is a fairly new idea, and I don't know where this is going. I haven't articulated it to anybody else. But is it 5? So I'll talk quickly. Okay. So with this concussion recovery that is number 5 in 5 years, I keep seeing the letters capital C, capital R, 5. And I think of concussion recovery, and I think of Coggenshaw River, which is the river that was the original power source for the old mill building that I'm in Middletown, where the studio's been for 21 years and where I've lived on the floor above in an apartment for 7 years. And so the site of the Coggenshaw River is this place where I'm doing most of my recovery. I'm pretty homebound. And I spend much more, I mean, each time this happens and I have to stop working for a while, I end up spending more time outside, which is pretty great. And remembering, right, this connection, this thing I don't do enough when I'm busy working. And so it's somewhat parallel. So toward the beginning of this, I was stuttering a lot. I couldn't find words. It was so exhausting to talk, you know, all that stuff. And besides physical symptoms. And so I just didn't talk that much. And I kept being attracted to surfaces outside. I'd look at rocks and I'd think I'd want to do rubbings on them. And it reminded me so much of when I had the opportunity to live in Kyoto, Japan in 2003, where I also wasn't talking very much because I didn't speak more than a handful of phrases in Japanese. And I ended up, and I had no printing press with me, and it was for months, and I was so elated. And I did a lot of rubbings. You know, the things I could understand were nonverbal, and they were surfaces, and I could touch them. in this way, you know, soft papers and colored pencils or, you know, charcoal or what have you. And so I'm thinking about something that actually is additioned that combines some plates that I make from rubbings and some text, and it may even be a scroll book, I'm not really sure, but that it's this long weaving thing, and it involves both some original rubbings on all of the copies, as well as printings of other rubbings, and then the text, some of which I'm, you know, was saying here. So that's what's kind of new, and I don't know if it's going to happen or not.
So I think we can continue this upstairs in the Book Arts Gallery, especially the students who might be too shy to ask questions right now. So there's, so on the third floor, there's actually there's an exhibition on our new Werner Gundesheimer collection. We received 600 travel books on Italy. That's up in the center of the Book Arts Gallery. And then Barbara Blumenthal did a small show of Robin's books right outside the Rare Book Room. And I'm going to go up and open the Rare Book Room where we've got some of the larger books that Robin talked about. So before you have drink and food, just come, you can quickly look at those, and then we've got a great array of food, I understand, that Barbara's figured out. So she'll host you up there with the food and drink. So thank you so much, Robin. Thank you. I have the catalog of Robin's work with, she brought some copies. So if you're really interested in her work, these are $20, and I have a bunch up in the Rare Book Room, so you can buy them if you like.
Can I say a couple of words?
Yeah.
We actually won some award for this catalog, and Betty Bright wrote the main essay, and Susie Taraba, who's Special Collections librarian at Wesleyan, did an interview, and Rutherford Withus, who is here in the audience, did the bibliography, the delightfully annotated bibliography. There's like 30 different random cover differences.
Really?
I can't explain it right now, but maybe one-on-one in person I can. Okay, let's go party.